Look, she wasn't supposed to crawl back out of that hole. That's what Julian had counted on. That's what the man in the slate-gray three-piece suit, cuffs linked, charcoal tie perfectly centered, posture as rigid as a tombstone, had calculated down to the last shovel of dirt. The location was perfect. 4 miles past the old fire break in the Blackwood Preserve, where the soil is thick with clay and the cell service dies long before you reach the tree line. He'd thought of everything: the moonless Tuesday night, the untraceable rental truck, the 6-foot depth he'd measured himself. He'd thought of everything, everything except the one thing he didn't know about Maya. She was 28 years old, Maya Thorne. In the flickering light of a single industrial flashlight, she looked less like a human being and more like a broken doll. Her silk blouse, the one she'd worn to what she thought was a celebratory dinner, was shredded and stained with Georgia red clay. Her hands were bound with heavy-duty zip ties, her fingernails already bleeding from clawing at the wooden crate they'd forced her into. You could see the terror in her eyes, even if the duct tape over her mouth turned her screams into a low, rhythmic thrumming that sounded like a trapped bird. And honestly, that image alone should tell you everything you need to know about the kind of man Julian Vance really was. Because as the first heavy clod of earth hit the lid of that box with a hollow, final thud, he didn't even blink. He didn't look away. He just checked his Patek Philippe, noted the time, and adjusted his collar. But then, and this is the part nobody, especially Julian, saw coming, 2 days later, the doorbell at the Vance estate rang. It was 7:00 p.m. Julian and his partner Sarah were sitting in the dining room, silver forks clinking against fine china, celebrating a tragic disappearance and a very large insurance payout. Julian got up, straightened his silk robe, and opened the door. Standing there, under the porch light, was Maya. She was still wearing the shredded silk blouse. Her hair was a matted nest of pine needles and dried mud. Her skin was a ghostly, translucent blue from the cold. But her eyes were wider than they'd ever been. She didn't say a word. She just stood there, dripping muddy water onto the Italian marble foyer, holding a single, rusted garden trowel. Who does that? Who spends 48 hours buried under 6 feet of suffocating earth, and then walks 3 miles through a dense forest just to ring the front doorbell? We'll get to that, because trust me, the reason Maya survived that hole has a lot less to do with luck and a lot more to do with a secret Julian had been keeping for a decade. A secret that's about to turn his perfect life into a crime scene. Julian didn't scream when he saw her. He didn't even gasp. He just stood there, his hand still on the brass doorknob, and noticed a small smear of mud on his white robe. He flicked it off with his thumb, his face as calm as a Sunday morning. Beside him, Sarah stood in the shadows of the hallway, her designer wine glass frozen halfway to her lips, watching Maya with an expression that wasn't fear, it was recognition. These two people, the calculated executioner and the silent observer, they had spent 3 years making sure Maya Thorne didn't exist anymore. That should scare you, it really should. Look, before we go any further, I need you to understand who Maya Thorne actually was. Because if you just see her as the girl in the mud, you're missing the point. Maya wasn't a victim of circumstance. She didn't just stumble into a nightmare. She was walked into it, led by the hand, step by calculated step, by the person who had spent 3 years studying her every heartbeat. Maya Thorne lived her life by the ledger. She was an actuary for one of the largest firms in the Southeast. Her entire job was calculating risk. She knew the probability of a car crash on a rainy Tuesday. She knew the exact percentage of houses that would burn down in a specific zip code. She believed in the safety of paperwork, the permanence of a signature, and the idea that if you followed the rules, the world would follow them back. That was her one flaw, her blind spot. She believed that because she was honest, the people she loved were bound by the same math. She didn't realize that for someone like Julian Vance, a marriage license wasn't a vow, it was a contract with a very profitable exit clause. And that's the thing that gets me. The person who survives isn't always the strongest or the fastest. It's the one who realizes, usually too late, that the most dangerous person in your life isn't the enemy you see coming. It's the person who knows exactly how you take your coffee. She didn't just fall into that hole. She was invited to her own funeral. But if you think this is just a story about a bad husband and a shallow grave, you need to stay with me. Because there are things about that night that don't make sense yet. Like, how does a woman bound in industrial-grade zip ties, buried under half a ton of Georgia clay, find the leverage to breathe, let alone escape? We have to talk about the open loops, the questions Julian is currently asking himself while Maya stands in his foyer. First, how did she get out? Second, where did she get that rusted garden trowel? It didn't belong to Julian. Third, who was the shadow Julian saw in his rearview mirror as he drove away from the woods, the one he convinced himself was just a trick of the light? Fourth, why was Sarah, Julian's supposed partner in crime, looking at Maya with recognition instead of terror? And the big one, the one that's going to change everything. What was in the liability assessment file Maya found in Julian's desk 3 weeks before the dinner? Trust me, if you think you know who the real villain is in this room, you don't, not even close. 6 months earlier, the sun was setting over the savannah skyline, turning the river into a ribbon of liquid gold. From the penthouse balcony of the Van Thorne estate, the world looked perfect. It looked expensive. Julian was standing by the railing, a crystal tumbler of Macallan 25 in his hand. He looked like a man who had never felt a moment of panic in his life. He was charming, he was wealthy, and at that moment, he was looking at Maya with a look of such pure, unadulterated adoration that it would have made a cynic weep. "To us," he whispered, clinking his glass against her sparkling cider. Maya was glowing. They had just celebrated their 2nd anniversary. They were the it couple of Savannah's high society. He was the visionary developer, she was the brilliant actuary. They were a power couple built on a foundation of mutual respect and, as Maya thought, deep, soul-shaking love. Julian was the ultimate white knight. He had met Maya when she was at her lowest, right after her father had passed away and left her with a crumbling estate and a mountain of legal headaches. Julian had stepped in like a hero from a Victorian novel. He handled the lawyers, sold off the dead weight, and helped her consolidate her inheritance into a trust that he managed to keep her stress-free. He was impeccable. He never raised his voice. He remembered her favorite flowers, peonies, even when they were out of season. He kissed her forehead every morning before he left for the office. He was the man who made her feel like the world was a safe place. But look closely at the details, because the devil isn't just in the details, he's in the things Julian didn't say. During that perfect dinner 6 months ago, Julian had mentioned a new project, a massive development in the Blackwood Preserve. He talked about the peace and isolation of the woods. He talked about how he wanted to take Maya there one day, just the two of them, to show her where their future was going to be built. Maya, ever the actuary, had laughed. "Blackwood, Julian, that's red clay country. The drainage is terrible. The risk of subsidence is too high for a luxury build." Julian had just smiled, that thin, controlled smile that never quite reached his eyes. "Trust me, Maya, I've calculated the risks. I know exactly what that ground is good for." In the months that followed, the perfect life began to develop hairline fractures that only an actuary would notice. It started with the small stuff. Julian was staying at the office later. His perfectly pressed suit started smelling faintly of wood smoke and damp earth. He began asking Maya very specific questions about her life insurance policy, the one her father had set up, the one that paid out triple for accidental death in a remote location. He phrased it as concern. "I just want to make sure you're protected, Maya. The world is so unpredictable." And Maya, because she loved him, because she believed in the math of their marriage, didn't see the trap. She saw a husband who cared. She didn't see a man who was looking at her like a line item on a balance sheet that needed to be erased. She didn't notice when he started practicing his knots with paracord in the basement. She didn't notice when he bought a rental truck under a shell company name she didn't recognize. She certainly didn't notice Sarah. Sarah was Julian's executive assistant. She was efficient, cold, and always wore shoes that were too expensive for her salary. Maya had met her a dozen times, and every time Sarah had been the model of professional courtesy. But there were moments, fleeting ones, where Maya would catch Sarah looking at her, not with jealousy, not with anger, but with a kind of clinical curiosity, like a scientist watching a lab rat approach a piece of cheese that was wired to a battery. By the time the night of the celebratory dinner rolled around, the trap wasn't just set, it was already closing. Julian had told her they were going to a private pop-up restaurant in the woods, a rustic, immersive experience. He told her to wear something nice, but to bring a coat because the air got thin out there. Maya had put on her favorite silk blouse. She'd put on her pearls. She'd even worn her silk-lined beige trench coat, the one Julian said made her look like a classic movie star. As they drove into the Blackwood Preserve, the self-service bars on her phone dropped one by one. Maya laughed, joking about being off the grid. Julian didn't laugh. He just gripped the steering wheel a little tighter, his knuckles turning as white as the marble in their foyer. "We're almost there, Maya," he said. His voice was as smooth as glass. "Just a little further into the trees. I want to show you exactly what I've been working on." He wasn't lying. He had been working on a hole, a 6-foot-deep, perfectly rectangular hole in the red Georgia clay. That should scare you, because the scariest thing about Julian Vance wasn't that he was a monster. It was that he was a monster who never forgot to use his turn signal. But as they pulled into the clearing, as the headlights of the truck swept over the freshly turned earth and the wooden crate waiting by the edge of the pit, Maya finally saw the math for what it was. She turned to Julian, her breath catching in her throat, her mind finally connecting the wood smoke smell, the insurance questions, and the liability files. "Julian," she whispered. He didn't look at her. He just turned off the engine, and in the sudden, deafening silence of the woods, he reached into the back seat for the roll of duct tape and the zip ties. "Look, Maya," he said, and for the first time in 3 years, his voice was cold. "It's nothing personal, you're just a liability that's finally matured. I know what you're thinking. How does a woman like Maya, a literal professional at identifying red flags, not see this coming? Well, that's the thing, she did see it, but she didn't see it in a dream or a gut feeling. She found it in a manila folder." 3 weeks before the dinner, Maya was in Julian's home office. She wasn't snooping, she's an actuary, not a detective, she just needed a highlighter. Julian was at the gym, and Maya had a stack of spreadsheets that needed color coding. She checked his top drawer, empty. She checked the middle, just receipts. Then she opened the bottom drawer, the heavy one. Tucked behind a stack of boring, Blackwood drainage surveys was a blue folder. It didn't have a name on it. It just had a string of numbers. Maya's brain, which works like a high-speed processor, recognized the string immediately. It was her social security number, followed by the policy number for her father's inheritance trust. She opened it, expecting to see tax forms. Instead, she found the liability assessment. Look, I've seen some cold things in these stories, but this was different. It wasn't a manifesto. It was a spreadsheet. Julian had listed Maya as an asset in column A and her maintenance cost in column B, but column C is where it got dark. Column C was labeled liquidation value. He had calculated her worth dead versus alive. He'd factored in the insurance payout, the inheritance tax, and even the estimated cost of disposal. He'd even accounted for the rental truck. And here's the part that should chill you to your core. Maya didn't scream. She didn't cry. She didn't call the police. You know what she did? She sat in his ergonomic leather chair, adjusted her glasses, and she fact-checked his math. "He forgot the probate fees," she whispered to the empty room. Her hands weren't shaking, not even a little. That's the detail that tells you everything about the Maya Thorne who was about to be born. The woman who loved Julian was dying in that chair, but the woman who could survive a grave was just waking up. She realized that Julian hadn't just stopped loving her, he had turned her into a math problem. And if there was one thing Maya Thorne knew how to do better than anyone on earth, it was solve for X. She put the folder back, exactly where she found it. She even aligned the edges of the papers to the millimeter. When Julian came home 20 minutes later, smelling of expensive cologne and sweat, she was in the kitchen, calmly making a salad. She even kissed him on the cheek. That's the part I can't get over. The level of control it takes to kiss the man you know is currently shopping for your casket. The night of the dinner, the air in Savannah was thick enough to chew. A storm was rolling in from the coast. the kind of Georgia storm that turns the sky a bruised purple. Julian was in peak form. He'd spent an hour getting the perfect crease in his trousers. He was humming a jazz tune. He looked like a man who was about to win an award, not a man who had a shovel in the trunk of his car. "Ready for our adventure, Maya?" he asked, holding out her beige trench coat. Maya looked at the coat. She knew that coat was about to become her shroud, but she put it on. She even let him button the top button, his fingers brushing against her throat. "I'm ready," she said. Now why did she go? This is the question that keeps people up at night. She knew the math. She'd seen the spreadsheet. But look, I'm not going to sugarcoat this. Love isn't a calculation. Even for an actuary, a part of her, the human part, was still hoping she'd misread the data. She was hoping that when they got to the woods, there really would be a pop-up restaurant with fairy lights and expensive wine. She was betting her life on the 1% chance that her husband wasn't a monster. That's the part that's almost unbearable. She didn't go because she was stupid. She went because she was hopeful. As they drove deeper into Blackwood Preserve, the paved road turned to gravel, and then the gravel turned to dirt. The trees started closing in, their branches clawing at the windows of the truck. Julian stopped talking. The jazz on the radio died out as the signal vanished. "We're here," Julian said. He didn't lead her to a table. He led her to a clearing where a single industrial light was pointed at a hole. The moment he reached for the zip ties, Maya didn't fight. Not yet. She watched him work. She watched the way he avoided looking her in the eye. She watched him struggle with the duct tape because his hands were finally starting to sweat. "Julian," she tried to say through the tape as he forced her into the crate. He didn't answer. He just closed the lid. And then came the sound, that hollow, rhythmic thud-thud-thud of red clay hitting wood. It's a sound you never forget once you've heard it. It's the sound of the world ending. Julian worked for 40 minutes. He was precise. He filled the hole, packed the dirt, and even scattered old leaves and pine needles over the top, so it looked like the ground hadn't been touched in years. He stood there for a moment, straightened his tie, and drove away. He thought he was leaving a liability behind. He didn't realize he was planting a seed. Inside the box, it was pitch black, and the smell, God, the smell. It was the scent of ancient earth, damp cedar, and her own shallow, panicked breath. The weight of the dirt above her was immense. It felt like the entire state of Georgia was sitting on her chest. Most people would have died of a heart attack in the first 10 minutes. The panic usually takes you before the lack of oxygen does. But Maya Thorne was an actuary. She closed her eyes and started calculating. Okay, standard wooden crate. Volume, approximately 18 cubic feet. My body displacement, 2.5 cubic feet. Available oxygen, 15.5 cubic feet. At a resting heart rate of 60 BPM, I have approximately 4 hours. If I panic, I have 40 minutes. Rest, she whispered against the tape. Just rest. But she wasn't alone in those woods. About 50 yards away, sitting in the notch of a massive oak tree, was a man named Sealers. Sealers didn't belong to the high society of Savannah. He didn't wear three-piece suits. He wore a heavy, oil-stained duster and carried a quietness that suggested he'd spent more time talking to the wind than to people. Sealers had been watching Julian for weeks, not because he knew Maya, but because Julian was building on land that didn't belong to him, land that Sealers had been custodian of for 20 years. Sealers had seen Julian dig the hole. He'd seen the practice runs. He waited until the tail lights of Julian's truck vanished. He waited until the forest returned to its natural rhythm. Then Sealers climbed down. He didn't use a shovel. A shovel makes too much noise, and in the Blackwood, noise carries. He used a heavy, rusted garden trowel and his own bare hands. He worked with a terrifying, silent efficiency. Maya heard it first, a scratching sound, like a giant animal digging for a bone. She stilled her breath. Was it Julian coming back to finish the job, or was it something worse? The lid of the crate groaned. Then, with a crack that sounded like a gunshot in the silence of the woods, a sliver of cold, night air sliced through the darkness. The lid was ripped back. Maya looked up. squinting against the dim starlight. She didn't see a hero in a white cape. She saw a man with dirt under his fingernails and eyes that looked like they'd seen the end of the world and weren't impressed by it. Sealers didn't say, "Are you okay?" He didn't offer her a hand. He just leaned over the edge of the pit, pulled the duct tape off her mouth with one brutal jerk, and handed her the rusted trowel. "You got two choices, girl," Sealers said. His voice sounded like gravel grinding together. "You can sit in this hole and wait for the cold to take you, or you can take this tool and start walking. But if you walk, you don't walk toward the police. You walk toward the debt." Maya sat up, her silk blouse ruined, her pearls lost in the dirt. She looked at the trowel. She looked at Sealers. "The math is wrong," she said, her voice raspy and raw. Sealers tilted his head. "What's that?" "Julian," she said, clutching the trowel until her knuckles turned white. "He forgot to calculate the variable." "And what's the variable?" Sealers asked, almost smiling. Maya looked at the red clay on her hands, the same clay Julian thought would be her end. "Me," she said. Sealers nodded once, turned around, and vanished into the trees like he'd never been there at all. Maya Thorne crawled out of that grave. It took her 3 hours. Her nails were gone. Her knees were shredded. But when she finally stood on solid ground, she wasn't the woman who lived by the ledger anymore. She was the variable Julian Vance never saw coming. And she had 2 days of walking ahead of her before she reached that front door. Look, I've seen a lot of movies where the hero gets saved and immediately goes to the hospital or the police. But this isn't a movie. This is the Blackwood Preserve, and Maya Thorne knew something that most people forget when they're in shock. Julian Vance owned the police. He'd built their new precinct. He'd funded their kids' little league teams. If she showed up at a station smelling like a grave, she wouldn't be a survivor. She'd be a missing person who accidentally fell on a set of handcuffs and into a river. So she didn't go to town. She followed the man in the oil-stained duster. Sealers' house wasn't a house. It was a converted firewatch tower tucked so deep into the canopy that the sun only hit it for 3 hours a day. It smelled like cedar, old grease, and wood smoke. And for the next 36 hours, it became the forge where the old Maya was burned away and the new one was hammered into shape. This is the part that gets me. Sealers didn't offer her a bed. He offered her a bucket of hot water, a needle and thread, and a cup of tea that tasted like boiled bark. "Wash the clay off," he told her, not even looking at her as he cleaned a rifle at the kitchen table. "Clay hides the truth. You can't think straight when you're wearing the earth you were supposed to rot in." Maya sat on a wooden stool, her ruined silk blouse stuck to her skin like a second, bloodier layer of hide. Her hands, those actuary hands that used to click pens and slide paper, were shaking so hard she could barely hold the cloth. And then she caught her reflection in a piece of polished tin Sealers used as a mirror. She didn't recognize herself. Her face was a map of scratches and bruises. Her eyes, usually so bright and analytical, looked like 2 pieces of cold flint. She looked unhinged. She looked at Sealers and said, "You're unhinged, aren't you? You live in a tower and watch people bury their wives." Sealers didn't miss a beat. He didn't even look up from his rifle. "Probably," he said, unbothered. "But being unhinged is the only way to stay on the door when the world is trying to blow you off it. You want to be sane and dead, or crazy and breathing." Maya actually laughed. It was a jagged, ugly sound that tore out of her throat and made her chest ache. "I'll take crazy," she whispered. "No cap, Sealers, I'll take crazy." That was the first humor beat. The first moment the pressure released. For the rest of that day, the vibe shifted. They weren't stranger and victim anymore. They were 2 people who both knew what it felt like to be discarded by the world. Sealers taught her how to stitch her own shoulder. He showed her how to wrap her feet so she could walk 10 miles without leaving a footprint. But more importantly, he listened. He listened as Maya talked through the liability assessment. He listened as she realized that Julian's plan wasn't just about her life insurance. It was about her father's trust, specifically the land rights Julian needed to finish the Blackwood development. Maya's father hadn't just left her a crumbling estate. He'd left her the heart of the preserve. The one piece of land Julian couldn't buy, couldn't bribe, and couldn't build on as long as Maya was alive. The room felt different after that revelation. The air got heavier. Maya wasn't just a wife who'd been betrayed, she was a barricade, and Julian was a man who hated barricades. Now this is where the world flips. This is where everything you think you know about this story gets tossed out the window. While Maya was in that tower, Sealers pulled a dusty, leather-bound ledger from under a floorboard. It wasn't his. It was something he'd taken from Julian's rental truck the night of the burial, a small black notebook that had fallen out of Julian's coat. "You think your husband is the architect?" Sealers asked, sliding the book across the table. Maya opened it, her breath hitched. The handwriting in the book didn't belong to Julian. Julian's writing was all sharp angles and arrogant loops. This writing was precise, it was beautiful, it was slanted and elegant. It was Sarah's. Look, you have to understand the level of world flip here. Sarah wasn't just the executive assistant. She wasn't just the mistress waiting in the wings. Sarah was the one holding the leash. The notebook revealed a pattern going back 15 years. Julian Vance hadn't built an empire. Sarah had built one using Julian. There were 3 other names in that book, 3 other liabilities who had matured in 3 different states, a developer in Florida, a hedge fund manager in Chicago, a widow in New Orleans. All of them had married a charming, impeccably dressed man who looked exactly like Julian. And all of them had disappeared after signing over their land rights to a shell company managed by Sarah. Julian wasn't a mastermind, he was an actor. He was a professional husband whose only job was to secure the asset and then dispose of the trash. Sarah was the director. Sarah was the one who calculated the drainage, the insurance, and the depth of the grave. Maya sat there, her hand over her mouth, as the full scope of the horror hit her. She wasn't just being killed for her money, she was part of a franchise. But Maya didn't collapse. She didn't cry for her lost marriage. She grabbed the weapon she didn't know she had. She grabbed her actuary brain. She looked at the names, the dates, and the shell company's signatures. She realized that while Sarah was a genius, she was an arrogant one. She used the same routing numbers for every single liquidation. Maya looked at Sealers. "I don't need a gun," she said. Her hands were perfectly still now, not a single tremor. "I need a cell phone with a data connection for 5 minutes." She wasn't the woman who stood frozen, deciding whether to look anymore. She was the one who was about to audit a monster. The walk back to the Vance estate took nearly 10 hours. It started raining, a cold, needle-like Georgia rain that soaked through the clothes Sealers had given her. Maya didn't care. She walked through the brambles, her ruined trench coat acting like a second skin. She reached the edge of her own property at 6:45 p.m. She stood in the tree line and watched her house, the perfect, penthouse-style estate she had once called home. She saw the warm glow of the dining room lights. She saw the shadows of Julian and Sarah through the sheer curtains. They were drinking wine. They were laughing. They were probably talking about the tragedy they'd have to report in another 24 hours. Maya didn't call the police. She didn't call for help. She walked up the driveway, her boots leaving heavy, bloody smears of red clay on the pristine white gravel. She reached the front porch. She looked at the brass doorbell, the one she'd picked out herself because it had a classic, welcoming tone. She rang it. The sound echoed through the house. Ding-dong, she heard Julian's voice. "I'll get it, darling. It's probably the delivery." The door opened. And we're back to the moment. The white robe, the Patek Philippe, the smell of expensive steak and red wine. Julian's face went through 3 distinct stages of death. First, confusion, then recognition. Finally, a terror so pure it seemed to turn his skin the color of ash. "Maya," he whispered. His hand was trembling on the doorknob. He looked down at the mud dripping onto his Italian marble. "The math was wrong, Julian," Maya said. Her voice wasn't loud. It wasn't angry. It was just factual, like she was reading a weather report. Julian stammered, his eyes darting to the woods behind her, looking for the ghost he thought he'd laid to rest. "How?" Maya didn't answer him. She didn't have to. She stepped forward, forcing him to back up into the foyer. She didn't look at Julian. She looked past him into the hallway where Sarah was standing. Sarah hadn't moved. She hadn't dropped her wine glass. She just stood there, her cold, blue eyes locked onto Maya's. "Hello, Sarah," Maya said. "Or should I call you by the name you used in Florida or New Orleans?" The silence that followed was so heavy it felt like it might collapse the ceiling. Julian looked between the two women, his mask of composure finally shattered. He looked like a puppet whose strings had just been cut. "What is she talking about, Sarah?" Julian asked, his voice cracking. Sarah didn't look at him. She didn't even acknowledge he was in the room. She just looked at the rusted garden trowel in Maya's hand. "You should have died in that hole, Maya," Sarah said. It was the first time Maya had heard her real voice, not the assistant voice, but the voice of the architect. It was a voice that sounded like ice cracking under a boot. "I know," Maya said. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a single piece of paper, a printout she'd managed to send to her own office from Silas's tower before the signal died. "But I did a little liability assessment of my own. I sent the routing numbers from the shell companies to the Federal Audit Bureau 20 minutes ago, along with the locations of the other 3 liquidation sites." For the first time in 15 years, Sarah's hand shook, just a tiny bit. The wine in her glass rippled. "You think you can take us down?" Sarah sneered, though the bravado was leaking out of her. "It's your word against ours. You're a traumatized woman who had a breakdown in the woods." Maya finally looked at Julian. She looked at the man she had loved. She looked at the man who had kissed her forehead while calculating her burial depth. "It's not my word, Sarah," Maya said. She held up the trowel. "It's the DNA on this tool. It's the rental truck Julian forgot to wash. But mostly, it's the fact that I'm still breathing." Julian lunged then. It wasn't a calculated move. It was the desperate act of a cornered animal. He reached for Maya's throat, his white robe flapping. But Maya didn't flinch. She'd spent 48 hours in the dirt. She'd been taught by Silas how to move when the world was trying to kill you. She didn't use the trowel. She used the heavy brass door handle. She swung it with a controlled violence that sent Julian crashing into the marble wall, his perfectly pressed robe now stained with his own blood. He slumped to the floor, sobbing. The white knight was gone. There was just a small, pathetic man crying on his own expensive floor. Maya turned back to Sarah. "The police are 6 minutes away, Sarah. I checked the average response time for this zip code." Sarah looked at the front door. She looked at the ruined woman standing in front of her. Then, slowly, Sarah set her wine glass down on the side table. She straightened her designer skirt. "You're good, Maya," Sarah said, a twisted kind of respect in her eyes. "I almost wish I'd hired you instead of trying to bury you." "You couldn't afford me," Maya said. And as the first blue and red lights began to flash against the trees at the end of the driveway, Maya Thorne didn't stay to watch the arrests. She didn't want to see the handcuffs or the shame. She just turned around and walked back out into the rain. The arrest of Julian Vance wasn't the grand, cinematic showdown he probably would have wanted. It was messy, it was loud, and it was deeply, satisfyingly pathetic. When the FBI team, the ones Maya had pinged from the tower, burst through those heavy mahogany doors, Julian was still on the floor. He was clutching a piece of his white robe, staring at the mud on the marble as if he could somehow negotiate with it. He tried to tell them he was the victim. He tried to tell them Maya had gone insane and attacked him, but the federal agents didn't even look at him. They were looking at the digital trail Sarah had left behind, the one Maya had unlocked with a single surgical strike to their routing numbers. They found the liquidator ledger in Sarah's designer handbag. They found the maps to the other sites, and as they led Julian out in handcuffs, his perfectly pressed suit finally wrinkled, his tie hanging limp like a dead snake, he looked at Maya one last time. He looked for a spark of the woman who used to kiss his forehead. He didn't find her. He found a woman who had done the math and realized he was a zero. But it was Sarah who gave me the chills. As the agents placed their hands on her shoulders, she didn't struggle. She didn't cry. She just watched Maya with that same clinical curiosity. As she was being led to the cruiser, she leaned in and whispered just loud enough for the body cams to catch it. "The next one won't be an actuary, Maya. I'll make sure of it." She was still smiling when they closed the door. She was still composed, but it didn't matter. The architect had lost her foundation. The puppet master had no more puppets. In the eyes of the law and in the eyes of the world, Sarah and Julian weren't masterminds anymore. They were just two more line items in a folder labeled evidence. They were finally irrelevant. 3 months later. The Blackwood Preserve looks different when you aren't being buried in it. Maya stood on the wraparound porch of a small, sturdy cabin on the edge of the woods, not the Vance estate, but a place of her own. The perfect penthouse had been sold, the furniture donated, the marble foyer scrubbed of its history. This place had yellow curtains, not the expensive, designer kind, but the kind that let in so much light it felt like the room was breathing. The garden was overgrown, tomatoes reaching for the sky, wild herbs tangling with the Georgia red clay. Maya liked it that way. She liked the mess. She liked that things grew where they wanted to, not where a ledger told them to. There was a sound of a heavy engine, and a battered truck pulled into the clearing. Sealers climbed out, wearing the same all-stained duster, carrying a crate of fresh cedar planks. He didn't say hello. He didn't ask how she was feeling. He just set the wood down on the porch and looked at the garden. "The drainage is still terrible," he said, his voice like grinding stones. Maya smiled, a real smile, the kind that reached her eyes and stayed there. "I know, the risk of subsidence is about 40%. And I like the way the mud feels under my boots," she said. They sat on the porch steps together in the silence. It wasn't a romantic silence. It was the silence of two people who had both stood at the edge of the world and decided not to jump. Sealers handed her a cup of that bark tea, and Maya took it without flinching. She looked at her hands. Her nails had grown back. The scars on her palms from the zip ties were still there, faint white lines against her skin. She didn't hide them. They were part of the math now. She wasn't the girl who lived by the ledger anymore. She was the woman who had survived the calculation. "Look, here's what I want you to take away from this." Maya Thorne didn't survive because she was lucky. She didn't survive because sealers happened to be in a tree. She survived because when the person she trusted most turned her into a number, she decided to change the equation. The real lesson here isn't about betrayal. It's about the fact that the person who survives isn't the one who never falls. It's the one who refuses to let the fall be the ending. Maya was buried 6 feet deep, but she realized that as long as you're still breathing, the story isn't over. You aren't a liability. You aren't an asset. You are the variable. If this story hit you differently, if you felt that red clay under your own fingernails, you know what to do. Hit that like button. Subscribe so you don't miss the next time the world tries to bury someone who knows how to dig. And I want to hear from you in the comments. I've been thinking about this all night, and I want your take. Who was more dangerous? Was it Julian, the man who actually held the shovel and kissed her while he did it? Or was it Sarah, the woman who sat in the shadows and wrote the spreadsheet that made it all possible? Drop your vote below. Let's get into it.